We gonna rock all through the Electoral College, and then we'll take it higher. We gonna rock all through the Electoral College, and then we'll take it higher.
Hey there.
Hey, Jen.
Are you feeling presidential?
I'm definitely ready to listen, learn, and maybe change my mind on a few things.
Okay, well, don't underestimate yourself. I think you know a lot more than you think you know.
Sure?
Maybe not.
You've met me, Jen.
I don't want to speak too soon. So we are going to delve into this. I'm going to do my best to try to explain the Electoral College, how it works, and try to understand why we still have the thing. I mean, I know why we have it, but it's clearly not working. Maybe it is working the way
I
it's
don't know.
intended
I don't get
to work.
it at all.
Yeah, it's a crazy system. I think it is an antiquated system. It is a system associated with slavery. And we're still feeling those ramifications today. So
maybe it needs a rebranding.
A rebranding. Well, there's a way to rebrand the Electoral College, and we're going to talk about it. It's called the National Popular Vote Movement for short.
That's a way better name.
It is yeah. Yeah, we're going to get into that. So there are alternatives to this shitty system that has now, I think, 5 times in history given us a president who did not win the popular vote.
And I don't understand how that can be.
Oh, okay. So
I'm that basic I don't understand, but I voted. Let's
start at the beginning, shall we? All right. I'm going to tell you how that happens and why it happens.
It might be because I really just fundamentally do not understand what the Electoral College is.
We're going to change that today. Carolyn's going to bring you might be asking, what the fuck is Carolyn doing here? Other than listening and learning, but she has psychological knowledge to impart. She is our neuroscience shrink person.
Yeah.
For lack of
I think
term.
I represent the average American who really doesn't understand these things, not because they don't care, but it's just, it kind of makes me, it brings me back to like high school physics or shit that like I just don't understand.
So if I asked you to define the Electoral College, what would you say? Clearly you couldn't, but what would you say?
Okay, well, this is what I came up with before I actually read the rest of our episode that you did a beautiful job writing.
Thank you.
So I'm under the impression that size matters with it. There are these big states and then there's little states.
Yes.
And each of the states has representatives,
correct,
right?
Yep.
So obviously the bigger the state, the more representatives.
That's
I
right.
do know that.
Yes.
So citizens vote, and that's a thing. But then this like dumb named Electoral College, which
it's not actually a college.
Is it like a room? It's like they sit in that room with the semicircle leather seats, and there's like a person, and then they all vote, and like they're like.
You might be thinking of the UN or actual Congress.
I have no idea.
Or caucusing.
I literally don't know what it is.
Okay.
And I don't understand why we need it. If my votes matter.
Yes.
Then why does the Electoral College win?
Well, you're on the right track.
Okay.
You may not understand necessarily how it works, but you, like I think a lot of Americans, based on statistics, wonder why we still have this thing and why we even need it. So let's start at the beginning. Let's do that. We'll do definition and history. Okay. So the Electoral College, let's talk about its origins, thanks to Britannica.com. The system by which the president and vice president of the United States are chosen. It was devised by the framers of the United States Constitution to provide a method of election that was feasible, desirable, and consistent with a Republican form of government. A republic, not like Republican, the party. Yeah.
Okay.
During most of the Constitutional Convention, presidential selection was vested in the legislator. The Electoral College was proposed near the end of the convention by the Committee on Unfinished Parts. I want to be on the Committee of Unfinished Parts.
I'm just thinking of it like the Vampire Diaries convention.
Yeah, that was rad.
Was it a cool convention like that?
Probably not. There was nobody wearing fake fangs or,
There's no concession stand.
There was no concession stand selling cheap jewelry that I bought a lot of. So the Electoral College was proposed, as I said, near the end of the convention, unfinished parts, yada, yada, chaired by this dude named David Brearley of New Jersey, to provide a system that would select the most qualified president and vice president. Historians have suggested a variety of reasons for the adoption of the Electoral College, including concerns about the separation of powers and the relationship between the executive and the legislative branches, the balance between small and large states, slavery, and the perceived dangers of direct democracy. So one supporter of the Electoral College was Alexander Hamilton, who we all know about thanks to the musical. Argued the room where it happens. I've only seen it once. Argued that while it might not be perfect, it was at least excellent. All right, Bill and Ted. Excellent. Good stuff. Article 3, Section 1 of the Constitution stipulated that states could select electors in any manner they desired and in a number equal to their congressional representation. This is senators plus your representatives. The 23rd Amendment, adopted in 1961, provided Electoral College representation for Washington, D.C. The electors would then meet and vote for two people, at least one of whom could not be an inhabitant of their state. So this is from the National Archives. The Electoral College consists of 538 electors. A majority of 270 electoral votes is required to elect the president. Your state has the same number. We talked about, how it's figured out in terms of numbers. So we're not going to delve really into how the electors are chosen, but you can check it out in our source notes.
But I always hear them talking about like these key states, like it's like Ohio.
Yeah.
Is California. Like, I guess it's hard. You're probably going to get to this, but like,
I am.
Okay. I'm going to shut up.
I'm going to tell you why these states that have so few electoral votes are so important in the race to the presidency, which is another thing that makes it kind of strange and unfair, for lack of a better word.
It's like they'll say like California, this person's already run, even though we haven't gotten the votes in from California
because it's a given that the Democrat is always going to win the presidency. At least, after I think Reagan was the last president, that Republican president that I believe California went for. I'm assuming he was governor here. So, all right. Don't have that information in front of me. Don't quote me. So if there's a tie, so one of the flaws of the system is that it can theoretically produce a 269 to 269 tie. If that occurs, a newly elected House of Representatives would decide the fate of the presidency. What is wrong with me today? I haven't even started drinking. Presidency on January 6th. January 6th. Remember that date.
Wow.
With each state voting as a unit, as required by the 12th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. Yeah, I think it was yesterday or the day before that Donald Trump referred to the January 6th riot as a quote unquote love fest. Okay.
Oh my, don't get me started.
No, we already covered that shit. 2 whole ass episodes. We're not going back.
Literally.
No. So why the framers selected this system? This is courtesy of AI. The framers of the U.S. Constitution were primarily concerned. This is hilarious to me, that direct democracy would lead to the tyranny of the majority, where a large group of poorly informed citizens could make impulsive decisions that might not be in the best interest of the nation, favoring instead a system of representative democracy where elected officials would make decisions based on careful deliberation. They feared the masses might be easily swayed by demagogues and make decisions based on passion rather than reason.
Wow.
The irony is killing me.
They're like the Simpsons. They predicted this shit.
Well, they couldn't have predicted the internet and all the crazy misinformation on there.
But then to me, that's making an assumption that those elected officials are not easily swayed.
Well, I mean, I think there was an assumption back in those days that if you're, white and land holding and, reasonably educated, that you are going to be in a better position to make a decision on who controls the country than somebody who's, a peasant farmer, for instance, but now everybody has access to information, whether or not they access, correct information or alternative facts.
Yeah.
That's something else entirely.
Yeah.
But everybody, compulsory school is free. Everybody can go to school for free until 12th grade. There are all sorts of ways that one can educate themselves now.
Progressed.
Yes, to an extent.
Okay.
Yeah.
So interesting.
Carolyn, can you maybe explain to our audience how people really do vote with their emotions, regardless of what the framers intended.
Yeah, finally something I can conceptualize.
Yeah.
Well, Jen, did you watch Mad Men?
Hell yeah, I did.
Remember that scene where they're trying to basically politically come to the marketing firm, I forgot the name of Sterling or whatever it was. But, politics and marketing and advertising go hand in hand. And a lot of the same things you see in sort of understanding how humans make choices and decisions and how to manipulate that. It's no secret that politics was right at the forefront of that.
Yeah.
And you saw that in Mad Men. They actually depicted, they wanted the Republican Party to be represented. And here's this time when JFK is coming on. And I remember John Hamm is like having some feelings about that. Spoiler alert. That was many years ago. Surprise, if you haven't watched it.
Don Draper's a Republican. The womanizer, like alcoholic.
I know.
Boy.
But maybe it ends well. Who knows?
Yeah.
So in the past decade, neuroscience has enabled us to identify the parts of the brain that get activated when you watch political events and advertisements. And that's done through magnetic resonance imaging, all different ways. We could basically take like x-rays of the brain, for lack of a better word. So what these results show us is that most people, surprise, surprise, are driven by fear and emotion, which what part of your brain is that?
Your amygdala.
Good job.
Yay.
Ding, ding. Which is deep, primitive brain. And, you're more likely going to make decisions based off fear and emotion than you would rational argument, especially in election campaigns.
Okay.
So there's this thing called the myth of the irrational voter. And this is probably what our founding fathers...
So patriarchal,
right? Daddies, the women
founding daddy,
the flags.
Oh my God! Yeah, let me be a flag bearer with my titty hanging out.
Yes.
Why when they showed these like really beautiful depictions of like early stage democracy, the woman holding the flag always has a titty hanging out
because she's got to have a boob for men to feel comfortable with her strength.
That makes sense. Okay.
Right? So here's a quote from an article. Voters are inherently, or this is the idea or the myth, right?
Tell me more.
Voters are inherently irrational. They are moved by emotions, not facts. Their biases cause them to make bad political decisions. Therefore, we need to shape our political processes and their irrationality to manipulate them to make more rational choices. We tend to use our guts and instincts, our gut, mistype.
My
guts are telling me to not vote for Trump. Jeez, maybe I need some alcohol too.
We're getting there.
All right.
We will after this.
Use our instincts on how, basically they call this like the would you have a beer with them question. Have you ever heard that?
Yeah, of course.
It's a political polling question. So I'm like, that's a very poorly written question. To half the alcoholics out there. But it's like, would you go have a cup of coffee with them? And coincidentally, I say that too when people are coming to therapy. I'm like, you should feel comfortable having a chat with me over coffee or tea.
Yeah, slightly different relationship than the person running the country. But
you want to feel comfortable. You want to like them. And so again, but just
him or her. Thank
you. Just as a job interview or them, as a job interview, the candidate's going to put their best image up front. And research shows intuitive estimation on gut-like abilities actually a poor indicator, not just on a job interview, but coincidentally also in voting. And even when you and I have done our fair share of hiring, we don't just look at the interview. It's actually always a panel. And even if it's not government, you're looking at a more 360 view. You're doing background checks. You're asking their former employers, which can be difficult. But you're also going off like, how do I feel around this person? Yeah. So here's the other thing. This doesn't bode well for women.
Well, your gut can be biased.
And it is. And that's perception is everything. And we're not trying to say don't be biased.
Right.
Know what your biases are and see them and acknowledge them in the room. Female candidates have to walk a tightrope between appearing likable but also competent. Right. And it's a problem that male candidates don't face. And this would probably, if you go down the intersectionality of a candidate, their race, their sexual orientation, gender, their physical abilities. Yeah. It's going to make it harder. So basically, if you're not a white male. So there's this myth that I talked about of the rational voter. That's not necessarily true. And here's why that makes sense. So research in psychology, cognitive neuroscience, and behavioral economics shows that we have a number of thinking errors that can cause us to make irrational decisions. That's a given. And it also shows that the younger you are, the less likely you're going to be able to have control of that because your brain is not fully developed. It hasn't had the experience. But the problem is we all tend to see ourselves as extremely rational and rational creatures, and we form our opinions based on logical facts. But in reality, it's just not true. Our emotions play a much larger role in influencing our beliefs than we intuitively perceive. And I think that goes against, what we think someone else is, like we talked about last time. If you don't agree with me, you're just wrong.
Yeah.
Politicians are also very skilled in the psychology of persuasion, and they can take advantage of our thinking errors to manipulate us. Unless we are actually paying attention, not just to our own biases and what we're sort of being spoon-fed, we're going to make biased political decisions.
Yeah.
And the truth, that's something called the illusory truth effect. Did I say that right?
Yeah, you did.
It's a thinking error in our mind that happens when statements are repeated so many times that we begin to see them as true.
Interesting.
Despite those statements being false. And I think of how much more social media has shifted that since the early 2000s. So, we're not saying don't be emotional. Our emotions drive a lot of things.
Yeah.
And that's normal and that's okay. But part of what we're trying to recognize in a collective system, or at least in my mind, is, do I walk into something knowing, that I have a bias? Where does that come from? How has that been shaped by my every background and everything that I've been given?
Yeah.
And also, how am I being manipulated within this? And not just looking at, if I vote yes or no on this, it's going to cost more money or it's not, but thinking like a chess game a couple steps ahead. And I think this goes into another thing you and I have talked about, is these questions are so, when you are voting, not so much for a candidate or not, but to do that type of legwork and to do it on both sides is really hard.
Yeah. No, it is. It is. And I think that also people have a lot of things going on in their lives, and they don't always have time to sit down and weigh the pros and the cons and separate fact from fiction. And you know what, your gut, there are problems with your gut, but I would not need to do any research on Donald Trump, for instance. All I would need to do is hear him or listen to him speak for 30 seconds to know that he is unhinged. He'll likely within those 30 seconds also say something sexist and racist or denigrate somebody on the basis of their looks. That tells me all I need to know. But unfortunately, that's an attractive characteristic for a lot of people out there.
Exactly. You could listen to our previous episode to
I'm not going to go down that road again. But anyway, trust but validate your gut.
Well, you can trust your gut in a safety situation.
Very true.
I think when it truly is, am I going to die? These are intellectual decisions.
Sure.
But they have repercussions. You do have to think about them because they are impacting you. And you have to think about, if this is or isn't impacting me, how is it impacting the people that are in my community?
Right. Exactly.
And that's the difference.
Yeah. You got to think
that's where your biases are. Well, I don't give a shit about homeless people. I do.
Right.
But the average person is like, I don't want that here.
Right.
So of course I'm not going to give my tax dollars to fund this candidate who wants to give more housing or do this or that.
Yeah. We're in this ruggedly individualistic society, at least for those of us that don't have money. It's rugged individualism. And so we see, not we, but folks who vote a certain way typically see candidates who care about folks and see how we're all connected and how disadvantaging one community disadvantages all of us. But a lot of people can't think that way because in the United States, you're trained primarily, more or less. To think
absolutely.
to think a certain way. So
absolutely.
Let's talk about, this is the perfect segue into the racist origins of the Electoral College. Now, this is the Atlantic via the Brennan Center. So I know it's probably one of my favorite publications. They do incredible work. So commentators today tend to downplay the extent to which race and slavery contributed to the framers' creation of the Electoral College. In effect, whitewashing history. Of the considerations that factored into the framers' calculus, race and slavery were perhaps the foremost. It was the economic engine that was still driving our society at the time. So delegates from the slaveholding South had another rationale for opposing the direct election method, and they had no qualms about articulating it. Doing so would be to their disadvantage. Even James Madison, who professed a theoretical commitment to popular democracy, succumbed to the realities of the situation. The populations in the North and South were approximately equal, but roughly 1/3 of those living in the South were held in bondage, slaves. Because of its considerable non-voting slave population, that region would have less clout under a popular vote system. So the ultimate solution was an indirect method of choosing the president, one that could leverage the 3/5 compromise. Does anybody remember from history what this is? So if you don't, Harvard is going to tell us. So the 3/5 compromise was reached among state delegates during the 1987. I'm sorry, 1987. This is 1987. No! Read, Jen, read. 1787 Constitutional Convention. It determined that 3 out of every 5 slaves were counted when determining a state's total population for legislative representation and taxation. Fucked up. More than 2 centuries after it was designed to empower Southern whites, the Electoral College continues to do just that. The current system has a distinct adverse impact on Black voters, diluting their political power. Because the concentration of Black people is highest in the South, their preferred presidential candidate is virtually assured to lose their home state's electoral votes, despite Black voting patterns to the contrary. 5 of the 6 states whose populations are 25% or more Black have been reliably red in recent presidential elections. 3 of those states have not voted for a Democrat in more than 4 decades. Under the Electoral College, Black votes are submerged. It's the precise reason for the success of the Southern strategy. So this is from Sojourners, another really good publication. Black folks in the South are outvoted all the time, said Wilford Codrington III, a constitutional law scholar and professor at Brooklyn Law. Georgia might be in play, and people are talking about it now, but it shouldn't just be happenstance that now a state is in play. A bunch of the swing states are not reflective of the country's demographic, or the county's demographic. No, the country's demographic. Sorry. He stressed white voters generally are overrepresented. Absolutely. And don't get us started on all the voter suppression that's still happening in Black communities, trying to dismantle the Voting Rights Act.
Well, and the prison system.
The prison system.
You're not allowed to vote if you're...
Yes, you were disenfranchised of your vote if you are a felon in most states. And so...
What about if you're on parole?
Well, you're still a felon. If you are a felon, right?
If you've served your time.
Even if you've served your time, is my understanding. I don't know, and I need to look into this, folks, if and when your voting rights can be reinstated. But this was a big thing in the 2000 election. The Catherine Harris was her name, and I can't remember. She was somebody in Florida. I don't remember if she was I can't remember what her position was, but she was working very closely with the Bush campaign, George W.'s campaign. And they were systematically purging Black voters from voter rolls and trying to say, oh, you're a felon. People would show up and they're like, I'm not a felon. And the strategy, unfortunately, combined with what the Supreme Court did in determining Bush the winner and Bush v. Gore, that really was a shit show. And so we've seen this shit for a really long time. Poll taxes and tests and all this bullshit. This is just, an extension of Jim Crow as far as I'm concerned. So,
yes, absolutely.
I mean, how terrible would you feel if you thought your vote didn't count, or if your vote really doesn't count? So, Carolyn, what is the science? Because we can't speak on behalf of any community.
Right.
What does the science and the data say about some of the possible psychological impacts of the system on Black voters?
Well, I'm going to say this very simply. It boils down to it hurts your self-worth inherently. And not just internally, the impact and stress and toxic distress on a person of color or anyone with varying intersectionalities of race and culture and gender and whatnot. You're going to feel unsafe. But let's just talk about how that incites an external sort of violent, what we're seeing with Trumpers and MAGA-ites. Maggots. This is okay.
Yeah.
And it can be a powerful, I think on the other side, it can also be a powerful collective activator to rise up, like we see with Black Lives Matter in our generation.
Yeah.
And any historical uprising that this is unfair. But again, for it to get to a place of violence, so much has to happen.
Yeah.
Racial incivility in everyday life, a conceptual framework for linking process, person, and context is an article that I found that looks at everything from overt forms of racism, microaggressions, which you and I know very well what those are, but I will explain those. And these are important. That what these studies found was that it's an important, I mean, even say an essential source of stress for individuals from diverse racial and ethnic backgrounds. So if you're looking to read this article, it's from Perspectives in Psychology of 2021. It's linked in our show notes. This was actually dedicated to the singular topic of microaggressions.
Oh, interesting.
Everything from statements, policies, environmental cues, anything that carries racial and prejudicial overtones from every walk of life. They looked at different age variabilities. It's a wonderfully written article. It brings in, it was like going back down memory lane of different or different researchers that I learned in school that are at the forefront of this robust and pretty extensive theory of psych. It's you could do a whole master's thesis on this.
This is a public health crisis. Racism in general.
So they looked at this through small scale. And they say sometimes this is unintended, but microaggressions always, whether it doesn't matter what you intended, it's always about impact, negatively impact the well-being of individuals when reinforcing harmful stereotypes in society. And again, I think I want to make a statement that you're not just, oh, you hurt my feelings. Yeah. This is a risk on someone's life. So you're devaluing it. Well,
associated with stereotypes.
Saying someone's 3/5 of a fucking person since the 1700s, and you think in the 2024, you're not still caring. We know from, what's the eugenics?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I always think it's the other one.
What is the other one? I know what you're thinking, but I think eugenics is the real negative shit. Yeah.
That, I'm sorry, epigenetics. We like epigenetics.
Epigenetics is good. Yeah.
But we know
eugenics is bad.
It's like when I was younger and I used to mess up diagrams and diaphragm.
Oh, that's hilarious.
I used to do, my mom had to drill into me in third grade. She's like, make sure you say it's a diagram, not a diaphragm.
Don't go to Christian school and say diaphragm.
Yeah. I'm like, I forgot my diaphragm for show and tell today. That is a true story. Anyway, Carolyn's an idiot.
No,
dyslexia. Something. Anyway, so moving forward. So the Association for Psychological Science published 13 papers examining the current body and research of pointing out the gaps in our understanding. And I want to point out to you that at the master's program at USF, we did an entire semester devoted to this topic. And I say that because in this clinical psych program, we only did 2 weeks on drug and alcohol abuse and sexual identity. But that's how important this is. And even USF was like, we got to give them a whole semester. Sorry, USF. So that should tell you how essential this topic is, and not just for social justice, but I think for you and I to talk about the collective healing that I think psychology owes people of color and what psychology has done. So this is very robust research. Microaggressions, just to let you know, if you don't know that, or perhaps to remind you, they influence how people see racial ethnic groups and value society places on them. They influence whether and how we can recognize systems of inequality that exist in the United States. I could go on and on about this. They reinforce white superiority. It also, there's secondary microaggressions, which gaslighting, victim blaming. Basically, if you even speak out against this, you're playing the race card, the victim card, you're playing the race card. So again, I could go on and on about the research, but it's bad. Yeah. Because what this does, while I can't speak about it from a race standpoint, I know as a woman and as a Jewish woman, what it feels like to get that type of microaggression directed at me. And it's really hurtful to who you are and what you believe in. Sure. So I can only imagine, I can't imagine, but I can only imagine how living and breathing that every single second of your life in every facet of your life and carrying that with you. Yeah. And then actually being told that if you talk about it, I mean, God, how much more inherently traumatic can that be? And we know this about trauma. We know this about what this does to our system. It causes inflammation. It causes fear. It causes again, PTSD. Anything you can think of that's bad for your body.
Well, doctors are starting to posit, and have been for quite some time, that, high rates of heart disease and heart attacks in the Black community aren't necessarily associated with diet. They may be associated with the stress of living day to day in a racist society as a Black person.
And all these diseases that we mark as, again, diabetes or, with the exception of sickle cell anemia, nothing's inherently an African-American disease, right? And even that, so these are things that we know now. We have the science, we have the research, and we have now we shouldn't need that to know that you don't call someone 3/5 of a person.
Right.
But fuck it. If you need the research, here it is.
Yeah.
Here's the people who are telling us this is really fucked up.
Yeah.
And what's not good for you is not good for we.
Right. And what this amounts to essentially is the social determinants of health, which we've talked about on this show. Then I'm still a trainer for racial equity training now, in my current job. But at my previous job, one of the facts I learned was in Oakland, which is a city, across the bridge from San Francisco, there's people who live above MacArthur-Bart, I think, have a life expectancy about 12 years higher than those who live below MacArthur-Bart. So if you're not familiar with Oakland, above the MacArthur-Bart line is places like the Oakland Hills and Piedmont, really nice places. Below that is where
white places,
right? Yeah. Below that, typically where people of color, primarily Black folks, live at, lower socioeconomic status. So big time social determinants of health here.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the opposition to the Electoral College, because there's a lot. Did you know that since the founding of the United States, there have been approximately 800 congressional attempts to amend or abolish the college? I had no idea.
I had no idea.
Pretty crazy, right? So this is from Britannica again. One of the most troubling aspects of the Electoral College system is the possibility that the winner might not be the candidate with the most popular votes. For presidents, Rutherford B. Hayes in 1876, Benjamin Harrison in 1888, George W. Bush in 2000, and Donald Trump in 2016 were elected with fewer popular votes than their opponents. And Andrew Jackson lost to John Quincy Adams in the House of Representatives after winning a plurality of the popular and electoral vote in 1824. So this has happened a few times. And actually, experts are saying this could happen more and more moving forward with the Electoral College. Anyway, so sojourners, again, we're going to go back to them. Like many critics of the Electoral College, Kowal, who's an expert who's quoted from this, believes the system is flawed in multiple ways. But at its core, the system is anti-democratic. On 5 separate occasions, which I mentioned, the college has awarded the presidency to the candidate who actually lost the popular vote. Need I remind you all that Donald Trump lost to Hillary by almost 3 million popular votes. Well, I mean, he won, but you know what I'm saying? Yeah. Anyway, she had almost 3 million more popular votes than he did.
Yeah.
So, not a fair system, not a democratic system. So this is from the Brookings Institute, why the Electoral College is poorly suited for an era of high income inequality and widespread geographic disparities. So this is a really interesting argument here. So at a time of high income inequality and substantial geographical disparities across states, there is a risk that the Electoral College will systematically overrepresent the views of a relatively small number of people due to the structure of the Electoral College. As currently constituted, each state has 2 Electoral College votes, regardless of the population size, and then add to that what I mentioned earlier, the additional votes to match its number of House members. That format overrepresents small and medium-sized states at the expense of large states. So this goes back to your first question. Okay, so the formula is problematic at a time when Brookings Metropolitan Policy Program Study found that 15% of American counties generate 64% of America's gross domestic product. Most of the country's economic activity is on the East and West Coast, and a few metropolitan areas in between. The prosperous parts of America include about 15 states having 30 senators, while the less prosperous areas encapsulate 35 states having 70 senators. So
what are they saying?
So I'll read this last portion. Let me read this last portion and then I'll explain what I think this means. So those numbers demonstrate the fundamental mismatch between economic vitality and political power. So this is answering your question, right? So through the Electoral College and the U.S. Senate, the 35 states with smaller economic activity have disproportionate power to choose presidents and dictate public policy. This institutional relic from 2 centuries ago likely will fuel continued populism and regular discrepancies between the popular and electoral votes. Rather than being a historic aberration, presidents who lose the popular vote could become the norm and thereby usher in an anti-majoritarian era where small numbers of voters in a few states use their institutional clout in left-behind states to block legislation desired by large numbers of people. So essentially, look at California, right?
Okay, yeah, I'm so lost.
Look at the population of California. And not only the population of California, this is an economic argument. And I see, I'm torn on this one.
Okay.
But I'm a Californian. We have the 5th largest economy in the fucking world. We are generating immense wealth. We are producing technology that the entire world is using.
California.
So yet we're constrained by the number of electoral votes we have. It is not enough, proportionally speaking, given the amount of revenue and technology and everything that we generate as the 5th largest economy in the world. So you've got these small states kind of holding the whole system hostage. They have more power than they should. So there was a good example that I looked at, and I wish I had put it in here, but it talks about the population of a smaller state, right?
Yeah.
And it talks about how many representatives they have basically
like
per person, right?
Okay.
But when you come and you look at California, you look at how few representatives we have per person. Yeah. Basically, we have so many people. And like this argument makes, we are generating all of this wealth and contributing to the economy and the GDP in a way that most places worldwide couldn't even dream of.
Right.
Yet we're constrained by the number of electoral votes that we have. It's not representative of our population or our economic prowess, if that makes sense.
So what they're saying is that if your economics should be called, or it should be a factor in representation.
Yeah, it sounds like they're saying like, hey, these big states, like they're the ones, or East Coast, West Coast, basically, they're the ones that are really generating all the wealth for this country.
Okay.
And they're the most populous states. And they don't have electoral votes that really, truly coincide with a fair representation of the amount of people.
Can I ask a question?
Yes. I don't know if I'm going to be able to answer it.
I think you will.
Okay.
So then, I'm being half Carolyn, half facetious.
Okay.
So then if we vote in these representatives, right? Yeah. Why vote at all? If we're just going to then have the Electoral College decide the votes anyway.
Well, typically the electors will always vote with what the folks want.
Yeah.
But
how do we know that, though?
That's the thing. And this is what we're worried about with the upcoming election, that there might be defectors. How do we know they haven't
been whipped?
I don't know.
Is there, but no, for real, like is from what's that show, House of Cards, is there a whip for the electrical college?
They're a whole different college. Yeah. We're talking about apprenticeships and shit with electricians. That I don't know.
Sorry. I am a Democrat, but I'm also feeling a little distrustful of my government.
Yes.
So why should the way I'm understanding this is that the popular vote could say we wanted Hillary.
Right.
But it doesn't mean anything because this Electoral College said something else.
So is your question essentially, how is it possible for the electoral vote to produce a different result than the national popular vote? Okay.
Yes.
So this is from the government's website, archives.gov. I think this is the best way to answer that. It's important to remember, as we know, that the president is not chosen by a national popular vote. The Electoral College vote determines the winner, not the statistical plurality or majority a candidate may have in the national popular vote. Electoral votes are awarded on the basis of the popular vote in each state. So that's what it is. It's the popular vote in each state rather than the direct popular vote, if that makes sense.
That sort of does. Yeah.
Okay. So 48 out of the 50 states award electoral votes on a winner-take-all basis, as does the District of Columbia. For example, all 54 of California's electoral votes go to the winner of the state election, even if the margin of victory is only 50.1% to 49.9%. In a multi-candidate race where candidates have strong regional appeal, as in 1824, it is quite possible that a candidate who collects the most votes on a nationwide basis will not win the electoral votes. In a 2-candidate race, this is less likely to occur, although we've seen it now happen 5 or 6 times, right?
Yeah.
So here's this. In 2016, even though millions more individuals voted for the Democratic candidate, Hillary, than the Republican candidate in California, Pennsylvania, and Texas, if you add the votes from the 3 states, the Democratic Party was only awarded the electors appointed in California. Because the Republican candidate won the state popular vote in Pennsylvania and Texas, the Republican Party was awarded 3 more electors than the Democratic Party. Whoa.
Wow.
So that's kind of, it's interesting. So
It sounds very complicated.
It is complicated. But all we need to know for the purposes of this episode is that it's not a 1-for-1 vote. Okay.
And this needs to be revised because it sounds like this was something that was set up at a time where the population was much smaller.
Correct.
The country was much smaller.
Yes.
And like many things in the Constitution, we need to revise.
Yes, we absolutely do. So do you want to hear about, a solid alternative that's gaining crazy momentum in the past decade? Please. I love this. And I've told so many people about this since I started doing our research. In fact, I just made a TikTok about this today. So this is called the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. NPV for short.
I like that. That's way cooler.
Right?
Rebrand.
Sounds like MVP. MVP. It's a multi-state agreement that, when active, would ensure that the presidential candidate who wins the popular vote nationally also wins in the Electoral College.
Yes.
Here's how it works. This is from the Brennan Center. In the current Electoral College system, we know that the person who's awarded 270 of the 538 available electoral votes is the winner, right? Mm-hmm. The Constitution gives state legislators the right to choose how presidential electors are chosen. And since the 19th century, each state, with the exception of Maine and Nebraska, has awarded its electoral votes to the winner of the popular vote in that state. But under NPV system, states would commit to award their electoral votes to the winner of the national popular vote instead.
That sounds like a better system.
It's much easier, and I think much more appropriate for democracy.
This idea?
I don't know who invented it, but it's been around for a while. So about 10 years now.
Okay.
Or more, actually. So the compact will go into effect only when states controlling at least 270 electoral votes have joined. In the election, after that threshold is reached, the MPV states would ensure that the winner of the national popular vote becomes the president. So while the compact would not abolish the Electoral College, you can only do that with a constitutional amendment, it would guarantee that the winner of the Electoral College vote and popular vote are the same. Want to know how close we are to making this happen?
How close?
Let's make this a reality, because the campaign to pass the compact began in 2006 and earning its first victory in Maryland the following year. And since then, 15 states, including DC, have signed on. So now, if what I read is current, we are at 196 pledged electoral votes. That's 72% of the way there.
These are typically Democratic.
Yes.
Too.
Yeah,
I noticed.
Totally. Yeah. We really, because, and I didn't go into it here, but the Electoral College does typically tend to benefit Republicans. There's tons of research out there on that. This isn't me telling you this. This isn't opinion. This is fact from very, very smart, some very, very fine people, some very smart people. So I'm going to move forward a little bit here because we are really talking a lot. So, just know that there was a Gallup survey that reported, this was in 2000, 73% of Democratic respondents supported a constitutional amendment to abolish the Electoral College and move to direct popular voting. But only 46% of Republican respondents supported that view. Let's jump forward to 2016. Now we have 81% of Democrats and 19% of Republicans affirmatively answering the same question. So you can see that there's a benefit here for Republicans. So, Carolyn, since this is mostly political and historical fact, I don't really have a psychological question for you about the Electoral College, but I did come across an article noting differences between conservative and liberal brains. Explain.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought this up because it came up a lot in a lot of voter myth and sort of emotional stuff. But there's a 2013 book called Predisposed. And there's a 2020 Scientific America article that we linked, which introduced the idea of the general public to the field of political neuroscience.
Okay.
Basically, the more we understand about the brain, we can understand cognitive-based emotional decisions. I'm being very specific with that terminology. So on the whole, I hate that phrase. The research shows conservatives, and this is from the article, conservatives desire security, predictability, and authority more than liberals do. And liberals are more comfortable with novelty, nuance, and complexity. I'd say that's true.
Yes.
So they're saying if you put someone in an MRI, you could actually see differences in the brain of someone who qualifies themselves as a Republican versus a Democrat.
Okay.
They process social and emotional information differently in their gray matter and their neurocells. And to be more specific, their singular cortex. And that's the area that helps detect errors and resolve conflicts. It tends to be larger in a liberal. But the amygdala, which we talked about
if you
earlier.
Don't use it, you lose it.
Yeah, right. The amygdala, which you talked about earlier, and always comes up when we talk about emotions and trauma, is important for regulating emotions and evaluating threats, is much larger in conservatives. So while these findings are remarkably consistent, obviously, and I have huge problems with this, it's not certain because you always have individual variability.
Right.
So what can the study of neural activity suggest about political behavior, I think is a better question. And this is a very fascinating field, which if you could go back to school, I think this would be cool for your political neuroscience. They're beginning to move to beyond describing basic structural and functional brain differences between people and sort of ideological persuasions. And basically who has the biggest amygdala, right? And they're looking at more nuanced investigations of how certain cognitive processes underlie our political decision making and thinking. Partisanship does not just affect our vote, it influences memory, reasoning, and even our perception of truth. And knowing this doesn't magically bring us all together, but researchers hope that continuing to understand the way that this influences our brain is important. And I found this from a article called The Conversation. Voters are more susceptible to messages, and we know this from marketing, that stress negative rather than positive. And researchers found that negative images and statements about products lead to heightened activity in the dorsal prefrontal cortex, and that's directly associated with decision making. So remember how I said fear and emotion tends to lead voting. So that's a big deal when it comes to, how we're looking at advertising. They are going to play on your fears, and you have to. And again, you always hear like older people vote more. Well, yeah, they tend to have more.
Well, their worlds are smaller, and they're home watching the news, and they're afraid of everything.
They also have more dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and they're more cautious. So, and I'll do a TikTok about how. So now that we know that, basically now what?
Yeah.
And it really just, I could sum it up, and you got to think through this stuff. You got to think, you got to feel, you got to look at your perceptions, look at your biases. Don't be afraid to look at where they come from. That doesn't make you bad. I will not shame you for that.
But if you don't think what you're thinking is bias, and you just think it's the truth,
that's a problem.
That's, I think, where the problem lies.
There's no such thing.
Right.
I think, I remember, my parents growing up were Republican. My mom is not anymore.
Yay.
But I remember going, well, that's what my parents did.
Right.
So of course I'll do that.
That's right.
That's what we did in our home. And it wasn't until I got out and really started living my own life. And
that's why conservatives are really starting to infiltrate colleges. I was talking to somebody yesterday who lives in North Carolina, and she was talking about, she lives in Chapel Hill, and was saying how wonderfully progressive it is, but that how the university is changing. And the conservatives are really starting to infiltrate this university because they know that college typically has a liberalizing effect.
Yes. Knowledge is power.
Knowledge is power, bro.
Yeah, so anyway.
Okay. Interesting stuff. I appreciate it. I love the insight. So, is there anything else you wanted to add? Anything?
I mean, I think, as we go into kind of the final thought, I think also just looking at brain science and logic is such a Western concept.
Yeah.
And I'm going to get real granola crunchy here. But, if all we're looking at is our brains, we also have research now, because God forbid we do anything just based on ancient wisdom and and spirituality. But, our hearts carry much more power than our brains ever can.
Interesting.
And the heart is a kind of brain that contains 40,000 more neurons and brain-like cells, and it sends more messages to the brain than vice versa. And this is recognized by the work of Kimberly Schneider in her new book, The Hidden Power of the Five Hearts. Wonderful book.
Cool.
I could not speak about it enough. But that's, to me, from a healer perspective and from a therapeutic standpoint, we need to actually go beyond our brains because our brain is a computer. If you tell it to think one way, it'll give you all the reasons to do it. If it'll tell you, if you've ever had a drunken moment, should I do this or
Don't
should
text,
I not?
Baby.
Don't text,
do it.
right? But, we have to actually look at our hearts.
Yeah.
And what Kimberly talks about is how we're actually in a dark heart state. That there's these 5 stages of the Ayurvedic heart. And that tends to have political repercussions because we're closing down a part of our body, again, that lets you see someone as 3/5 of a human. And, again, I think, and I know so many other feel, you included, that what's missing from all of this is connection. And whether you want to call it spirit, religion, soul, I don't care, humanity, it has to do with our hearts and getting connected on a past the cognitive level, because your brain's only going to take you so far.
Yeah.
And your gut's also only going to take you so far. That's why we have 3 things that help us.
Right.
And also we have 3 things that help the government: executive, judicial, legislative.
Right.
Think of your body that same way.
Yeah. No, that makes
get holistic with the democracy.
I like how you went full circle on that shit.
Thank you.
Yeah. No, that was cool.
That came out of nowhere. I pulled that out my ass.
I liked it. And I was just thinking about how the Republicans would eviscerate us and be like, you guys are fucking snowflakes.
Yeah,
but right? It's true. And I'm not ashamed of thinking that way, because I think it's incredibly important. And I think that's what separates us. Although we have a lot of commonalities with people who politically think different from us, differently. And if you sit down and you actually have a dialogue with these folks, you find out typically that you're concerned about the same things. Yes. And if they don't have positive views of trans folks, for instance, a lot of times that's because they don't have any trans friends. Yeah. They've never met anybody from that population. And they're listening to people who don't know what the fuck they're talking about. Hateful people. Yes. But I think we'll be more easily able to achieve the state of being that you're talking about, which is obviously a lot healthier than just being filled with hate if we talk to each other. Yes. I'm not here to denigrate anybody except for the perpetrators of the January 6th bullshit. They're fucking stupid. But, for the most part, everyday Americans, though we think differently and feel differently, we're all human beings. Yes. And we all ultimately want the same thing.
And we're all in danger.
We're all in danger.
World, unless we work together.
We absolutely do. So, anywho, we hope you enjoyed our feeble attempt to break down the Electoral College, not just what it is, but where it came from and why it still exists. And it's because, again, it is benefiting a white, what's becoming increasingly a minority.
Yes.
A white minority.
That's frightened and afraid.
Right.
And they'll do anything rather than questioning why they're so afraid and what they're actually afraid of.
Right. Absolutely. So, this is all a part of a larger system, one that we rail about constantly of, systemic inequality and injustice. And that's why we are so eager to see this thing either transformed or abolished. Yes. So anyway,
thanks, Jen. I learned so much.
Yeah, I try. I do have a degree in political science.
Cool.
So, sometimes I can trot some things out.
I love it.
I needed a refresher myself. So anyway, y'all, we hope you enjoyed this. You can listen to us on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple. And you can also follow us on TikTok.
We're doing pretty good on TikTok.
At TwatJC. Yeah, people seem to like the political rants. So
weird.
Yeah. No, and I enjoy doing the political rants. So
you're very good at it.
It just comes from my heart, bro.
Yeah.
So anyway, we love you all. Stay positive, stay hopeful, and we'll see you next week.
Bye.
Bye.